Welcome back to Sherlock Mysteries, where every detail matters. Kindly like and subscribe to Sherlock Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? Let the investigation unfold. Chapter: I Fee, the Silent Chamber. It was on a bleak and wind-stirred morning in late November that I accompanied Sherlock Holmes to the residence of Mr. Alistair Pembroke, a man of considerable wealth and greater solitude. The message had reached Baker Street shortly after dawn, borne by a breathless footman whose agitation betrayed more than mere alarm. By 8 o'clock we were conveyed in a hansom cab through streets, veiled in a shifting grey mist, the hooves of our horse striking sharp echoes upon the damp stones. Holmes had spoken little during the journey. He sat forward, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen eyes half closed in that attitude of concentrated repose which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to intense activity. When I ventured to remark upon the unusual circumstance described in the summons, a chamber sealed from within, he merely inclined his head. "A problem, Watson," said he softly, "is never extraordinary in itself. It is the human mind that adorns it with marvels. We shall see whether Mr. Pembroke's chamber is silent from natural causes or from artifice." Pembroke House stood upon a quiet square in Kensington, its somber facade of Portland stone rising sternly above iron railings, blackened by time and soot. The household had already assembled in a state of anxious disorder within the entrance hall. A tall, pale gentleman in his early 40s stepped forward at once. He introduced himself as Mr. Edmund Pembroke, the deceased's younger brother and sole surviving relation. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, with a tremor that he attempted to disguise. Holmes inclined his head. "I am. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You have preserved the chamber as it was found." "Precisely as it was. We have not disturbed a single object." "Excellent. Then pray conduct us there." We ascended the broad staircase, our steps muffled by a runner of Persian weave. The air of the house was heavy with subdued voices and the faint, acrid odor of extinguished lamps. At the end of a long corridor upon the second floor stood the door in question, a substantial panel of oak fitted with a brass knob and a simple keyhole beneath. Mr. Pembroke gestured toward it with visible reluctance. It was bolted from within. We were forced to break it down. Holmes examined the door without touching it. The splintering about the lock was fresh and irregular. The bolt itself, now displaced, lay upon a nearby console table. He stooped to inspect the fragments, running a fingertip lightly along the grain of the wood. "You say the windows were sealed?" "Yes, they remain so." Holmes turned to the inspector present, a broad-shouldered man with iron-grey whiskers, who introduced himself as Inspector Gresham of Scotland Yard. "We found no sign of intrusion, Mr. Holmes," Gresham said with a tone of careful neutrality. "The deceased was alone in his room. There is no weapon, no poison bottle, nothing to indicate violence." Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "Nothing, Inspector. That is a rare achievement in this world." Gresham colored faintly, but said no more. We entered the chamber. I confess that a chill, independent of the November wind, seized me as I crossed the threshold. The room was of generous proportion, yet felt oppressively confined. Heavy curtains of dark velvet were drawn tightly across the tall windows, admitting only a muted light that rendered the air thick and stagnant. The hearth was cold, its ashes long undisturbed. A writing desk stood near the far wall, a wardrobe, massive and somber, and at the center, upon a broad mahogany bedstead, lay the body of Mr. Alistair Pembroke. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, spare of build, with high cheekbones and iron, grey hair brushed neatly back from a pale and composed brow. Death had lent his features an expression of faint surprise rather than agony. His hands lay at his sides. The bedclothes were scarcely disordered, yet it was not the body that first claimed my attention. Upon the bedside table, placed with almost ceremonial precision, stood a porcelain vase of delicate Chinese workmanship. Within it were arranged a dozen crimson roses, their petals full and velvety, their stems freshly cut. Tiny beads of moisture still clung to them, catching the dim light like scattered rubies. Their scent was unmistakable. It hung in the chamber, vivid and sweet, sharply incongruous against the stale air of confinement. Holmes approached the bed without haste. He stood for a moment in silence, his gaze moving from the body to the roses, from the roses to the drawn curtains, and thence to the floorboards. "May I?" he asked quietly. Inspector Gresham nodded. Holmes bent over the deceased, his long, sensitive fingers passing lightly over the man's wrists and throat. He examined the eyelids, the lips, the nails. From his pocket he produced a small lens and held it to the skin about the mouth. "Time of death?" he inquired. "Between midnight and 2, replied Gresham. "The butler states that Mr. Pembroke retired shortly after 11. He was accustomed to solitude and would not have welcomed disturbance." Holmes nodded absently. "There is no wound," I observed. "No sign of struggle." "Indeed," said Holmes. "And yet death is rarely so courteous as to leave a room in perfect order." He crossed to the windows and examined the fastenings. Each latch was firmly secured. A thin film of condensation lay upon the interior panes, undisturbed save for a narrow arc where moisture had dried unevenly. Holmes's eyes lingered upon that arc, curious, he murmured. Inspector Gresham followed his gaze. "Merely the effect of the fire being out, I should think." Holmes did not reply. Instead, he moved to the hearth and sifted through the ashes with a delicate instrument drawn from his case. There was little there. A residue of coal, some charred fragments of paper too small to decipher, and nothing else. "No sign of forced entry," Gresham reiterated. "No weapon. The door bolted. The window sealed. The servants swear that no one entered or left." Holmes straightened slowly. "And the roses, Inspector?" "The roses? Yes. Were they present when the door was broken? Certainly, they stood exactly as you see them." Holmes lifted one bloom gently between finger and thumb. He inhaled its fragrance with measured deliberation. "Fresh," he said, "cut within a few hours at most. And yet you tell me Mr. Pembroke retired at 11 and admitted no visitor thereafter." "That is correct." Holmes replaced the flower and regarded the room once more, this time with a faint narrowing of the eyes. "Mr. Pembroke's habits?" he asked, turning to the brother. "He was methodical to a fault," Edmund replied. "Rose at 7, breakfasted alone, conducted his affairs from home. He seldom entertained. He had few intimates. Did he keep flowers in his chamber?" "Never." "He disliked strong scents." Holmes's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And yet here they stand." The brother swallowed. "Yes." Holmes paced slowly from one wall to the other, his hands clasped behind his back. He paused at the writing desk. It was orderly, the blotter clean, the inkwell stoppered. A single sheet of paper lay at the center, blank save for a faint indentation, as though something had been written upon a page removed. Holmes angled the paper toward the light. "Inspector, has this desk been touched?" Only to ascertain whether a note had been left. And was there one? Number Holmes gave a slight hum of consideration. I could not suppress my own perplexity. "Holmes," I said, "if the chamber was sealed and no poison found, what agency could have operated here?" Holmes's expression was thoughtful rather than troubled. "My dear Watson," he replied, "when confronted with the impossible, one must re-examine the premises. Either the chamber was not sealed in the manner we suppose, or death did not occur by the means we imagine." He stepped once more to the bedside table and regarded the vase. "Death had visited," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But somehow it had not come alone." Inspector Gresham cleared his throat. "You believe, then, that this was not a natural death?" Holmes turned upon him with a glance at once courteous and penetrating. "I believe nothing, as yet, but I observe that Mr. Pembroke was a man who disliked strong scents, yet died in a room permeated by them. I observe that roses freshly cut stand in a sealed chamber. I observe a window whose condensation is disturbed in a singular arc, and I observe that a blank sheet of paper may speak more eloquently than a written one." He moved toward the door. "For the present, Inspector, I request that nothing be altered." The body must, of course, be examined with care. I shall attend the post-mortem if permitted. Meanwhile, I should like to speak with each member of the household separately." "And you suspect one of them?" asked Edmund Pembroke, his voice tightening. Holmes regarded him steadily. "I suspect, sir, that the truth resides within these walls. Whether it wears the face of accident, design, or betrayal, I cannot yet say." He lifted the porcelain vase with delicate precision and tilted it slightly, examining not the blossoms, but the water that sustained them. "Inspector," he said quietly, "pray furnish me with a shallow dish." A servant was dispatched, and within moments a small saucer of white earthenware was placed upon the bedside table. Holmes poured a modest quantity of the water into it. The liquid, though clear at first glance, betrayed faint impurities as it spread thinly across the dish. He bent low, producing his lens once more. The room remained utterly still. Even Inspector Gresham, whose earlier confidence had bordered upon impatience, now watched with undisguised curiosity. "You perceive something?" I ventured. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "Not what is present, but what is out of place." He allowed the water to evaporate partially in the faint warmth of the room, then tipped the dish so that the remaining moisture collected at one edge. A residue became visible, a faint trace of grit, coarse and pale, unlike any dust I had observed within Pembroke House. Holmes extended his forefinger and drew it lightly through the sediment. He then rolled the particles between finger and thumb with the absorbed expression of a chemist appraising a rare compound. "Granular," he observed. "Angular rather than rounded, and with a faint chalk admixture." Inspector Gresham folded his arms. Surely London is not wanting in dust. Holmes's eyes flickered upward. "London abounds in dust, Inspector, but not in this particular dust." He scraped a minute portion onto a scrap of paper and held it beneath the light. "The grains are of irregular size, pale buff in color, intermixed with crushed stone. This is not garden soil, nor is it the fine soot that permeates the city's interior. It is street sand, and recently laid." "Street sand," I repeated. "Yes, Watson. Observe the slight sparkle when the grains are angled toward the window. That is quartz content, characteristic of the sand distributed upon certain thoroughfares during inclement weather. Its purpose is to afford traction upon damp paving." Inspector Gresham's brow furrowed. "You suggest the sand was introduced from the street by whom?" Holmes replaced the paper carefully in his pocketbook. "That is precisely the question. Mr. Pembroke did not walk abroad at midnight to gather sand for his vase. Nor, I think, did his servants." He turned again to the roses. Each stem had been cut cleanly at a diagonal angle, the incision smooth and recent. No thorn remained upon the lower portions. They had been stripped with methodical care. "These flowers were purchased," Holmes continued, "not plucked from a private conservatory. Their stems have been trimmed by professional hand, and the water in which they stand carries with it the memory of the street from which they came. Cartwheel Street," he added softly. Inspector Gresham looked startled. "How can you possibly determine that?" Holmes permitted himself the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Because, Inspector, Cartwheel Street is among the few in this district where sand of this particular mixture is employed with regularity. Its proximity to the flower market makes it a place of heavy foot traffic and frequent dampness. I have observed its maintenance on more than one occasion." He rose and crossed to the window once more, drawing back the curtain by an inch. A shaft of grey light entered, illuminating the faint arc of disturbed condensation upon the glass. "Travel implies passage," he said, "and passage implies opportunity." I followed his gaze. The condensation formed a subtle crescent shape, as though something or someone had stood near the pane, altering the natural pattern of moisture. "You believe the roses were introduced after Mr. Pembroke retired?" I asked. Holmes inclined his head. "They could not have stood long in this room without wilting perceptibly. Their petals remain firm. The water shows no clouding from prolonged immersion. I should estimate they were placed here within 2 hours of death, perhaps less. Yet the door was bolted." "Just so, and the windows secured. Appearances, Inspector, are the most obedient of servants. They will present themselves in whatever guise we demand of them. Holmes now examined the vase itself. It was of delicate make, adorned with cobalt dragons upon a milky ground. He turned it upside down, scrutinizing the base. "A faint abrasion here," he murmured. "Recent. From what?" I asked. "From contact with a rougher surface than this polished table, possibly stone." He set the vase down and surveyed the chamber floor with renewed interest. The carpet was thick and dark, its weave concealing minor disturbances. Holmes knelt, passing his hand lightly over the fibers near the bedside. "There," he said quietly. I bent beside him. At first I perceived nothing, but upon closer inspection I discerned a minute scattering of pale grains embedded in the pile, scarcely visible unless one knew to look for them. "Street sand," Holmes confirmed, "transferred from the base of the vase, or from the shoes of the individual who carried it." Inspector Gresham shifted uneasily, but no footprints were reported, because none were sought with sufficient discrimination. Holmes rose again, his expression sharpening. "Consider the sequence. A man retires to his chamber. The door is bolted from within. Some hours later, he is found dead. Upon his bedside stands a vase of freshly cut roses bearing street sand in its water and upon its base. The room shows no sign of forced entry. Therefore, either the roses were placed before he secured himself, which contradicts the testimony of those who knew his habits, or the chamber was not as inaccessible as it appears." Edmund Pembroke, who had remained near the doorway in strained silence, spoke at last. "My brother received no visitors yesterday evening. I am certain of it." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Certainty, Mr. Pembroke, is a luxury seldom afforded to the living. We deal not in assurances, but in evidence." He moved toward the writing desk once more and examined the blank sheet upon it. Taking a pencil, he shaded lightly across the surface. Gradually, faint indentations emerged, the ghost of words pressed into the paper beneath a previous page. Inspector Gresham leaned forward. "Can you read it?" Holmes paused, then nodded slowly. 11:30, as agreed, alone." A silence fell upon the room more profound than any before. "Then he expected someone," I said. "Precisely, Watson. Someone who came at 11:30, someone whom he anticipated, and therefore admitted willingly." Inspector Gresham's voice was low. "But the servants swear." Holmes raised a hand gently. "The servants swear to what they observed. They did not observe everything." He returned to the bedside table and regarded the roses with renewed intensity. "It was not merely water that filled this vase," he said. "It was a silent witness. These flowers have traveled from Cartwheel Street to this chamber. They have passed through London's damp air, gathered its sand, and borne it here. And in doing so, they have testified to movement within a room declared immovable." Holmes straightened to his full height. "The question now is not whether Mr. Pembroke received a visitor," he continued. "He most assuredly did. The question is how that visitor departed, leaving behind a bolted door and sealed windows." He turned toward the inspector. "I must visit Cartwheel Street at once. There are florists there who may recall a midnight purchase. Inquiries made discreetly may prove illuminating." "And if no one remembers?" Gresham asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "Then we shall rely upon the roses themselves. Every journey leaves a trace, and every trace, properly read, reveals the path taken." As we descended the staircase once more, the scent of crimson blossoms seemed to follow us, sweet, insistent, and faintly accusatory. The silent chamber had begun to speak, and in the faint grit at the bottom of a vase, the first unmistakable whisper of human agency had emerged. Chapter 3, The Servant's Oath. It is one of the curious privileges of my association with Sherlock Holmes that I have been made acquainted with every variety of human emotion at its moment of greatest strain. I have seen courage dissolve into hysteria, grief harden into deceit, and innocence wear the mask of guilt merely because it trembled. On that same bleak morning, in the dim morning room of Pembroke House, I witnessed another such transformation as the servant, Thomas Hale, delivered his oath. He was a thin, sandy-haired man of perhaps 30, dressed in the severe black of a household servant, his hands clasped so tightly before him that the knuckles shone pale. His face held that anxious rigidity which one sees in a creature driven into a corner, yet there was no insolence in him, only a desperate desire to be believed. "I swear it, sir," he said, his voice wavering as he addressed Inspector Gresham, though his glance flickered repeatedly toward Holmes with the instinctive recognition that authority in that room wore a different form. "Not a soul has crossed the master's threshold for 7 days. Not one visitor. Not one errand. Boy, not even the postman comes beyond the hall." Holmes had seated himself with apparent indifference in an armchair near the fireplace. His posture was lax, his eyes half-lidded, and yet I knew that not a syllable escaped him, and that every gesture, every hesitation, was being gathered and weighed. 7 days, repeated Gresham, making a note. "And you are certain of this?" "As certain as I am of my own name, sir." "And your name is Thomas Hale," said Holmes softly, without looking up. The servant started, as though struck by a whip, and his eyes widened. "Yes, sir. Thomas Hale." Holmes opened his eyes fully now, and regarded him with a calm, fixed attention which is more unsettling than any display of anger. "You have been in Mr. Pembroke's service how long?" "Near 3 years, sir." "And before that?" "I was in the employ of Mr. Pembroke's solicitor, Mr. Carruthers." Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "Ah, I did not at once comprehend the significance of that small utterance, but it was one which Holmes could invest with meaning." Gresham continued. "Tell us of last night, the master's movements." Hale swallowed. Mr. Pembroke took his supper at 7:30, as always alone. He spoke little. He seemed preoccupied, sir." "Preoccupied? In what way?" Holmes asked. Hale hesitated, then shook his head. "I couldn't say, sir. He was preoccupied often. He had affairs, papers, troubles, maybe. He did not confide in us. And after supper, he retired to the study. I brought him tea at 9. He dismissed me at once. At 11, as is his habit, he rang and I attended. He asked that the fire be let die. He dislikes a warm room. Then he bolted himself in." "Always?" Holmes interjected. "Always, sir? Why?" Hale looked distressed, as though the very question were improper. "He liked his privacy, sir. He had an anxious disposition. He would not have the servants coming and going in the night." "And you heard no sound after he bolted the door?" "No, sir. Nothing. Not a footstep. Not a voice. Not so much as a cough." Holmes steepled his fingers. "You sleep where?" "In the servants' quarters, sir, on the ground floor, and the corridor outside his room. Who passes there during the night?" "No one, sir. There is no reason. The family rooms are on the first floor. The master's chamber is alone in that passage. It is as quiet as a tomb." Holmes's gaze did not waver. Quiet things often hide movement best. Gresham glanced toward him. "You doubt his oath?" Holmes made a small, languid motion with his hand. "I doubt nothing. I merely note what must be reconciled. Mr. Hale says no visitor entered. Yet fresh roses appear in a sealed room. Either the flowers grew there by miracle, or the oath is incomplete." Hale's face flushed a sickly red. "I swear I speak the truth." Holmes's voice softened fractionally. "I have no wish to distress you, Mr. Hale, but understand this. A man may speak truth, and still mislead, if he speaks only what he believes and not what is. I would ask you a different question." He leaned forward, his eyes now keen and direct. "Did Mr. Pembroke ever receive visitors without your knowledge?" Hale's mouth opened and closed. He glanced toward the door, then toward Edmund Pembroke, who stood stiffly near the mantelpiece. I don't understand, sir." "Yes, you do." A silence gathered in the room. The clock upon the shelf marked it with a slow, indifferent ticking. Hale licked his lips. "Sometimes," he whispered at last, "letters came, sealed, no address. The master would put them in his pocket. He would say nothing. Sometimes he would go out at odd hours, early morning before I was up, or late afternoon when I was sent on errands. Holmes nodded as though he had expected no less. And sometimes he would meet someone? Hale's eyes darted again. I couldn't say, sir. Holmes let the matter rest, but I could see that he had taken the measure of the man. Fear and guilt are often indistinguishable in the timid. Hale's terror might be that of an innocent servant implicated by circumstance, or that of a man who knew more than he dared confess. Inspector Gresham now addressed him more sternly. When did you discover the master's death? At 7, sir. I brought his breakfast tray. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I tried the handle locked. I called through the door. No reply. I fetched Mr. Pembroke and the butler. We forced the door. And the bolt was fastened. Yes, sir. Firm. Old, but firm. Holmes turned suddenly. Old. Yes, sir. The bolt is old. It sticks sometimes. The master liked it because it was stubborn. Holmes's eyes sharpened. It sticks sometimes in what way? Hale looked relieved to offer something concrete. It slides, sir, but the catch is worn. You must lift it slightly as you push, or it snags. Holmes leaned back again, expression unreadable. Interesting. Gresham scribbled. And the windows. They have not been raised in weeks, sir. The master hated the winter air. And the catches, he kept them latched. Did you see them latched yourself yesterday? Holmes asked. Yes, sir. When I drew the curtains at dusk, I saw the catches. They were down, Holmes nodded, but his gaze had drifted, as if Hale's words were only part of the picture he was assembling. He rose and paced slowly to the window of the morning room looking out upon the fog. Leyden Square. Then he turned abruptly. Mr. Hale, said he, do you polish the brass in the upper corridor? And did it remain bright? Hale frowned. It was. Somewhat dulled when I saw it this morning, sir. How dulled? As if it had been handled. Holmes turned to Gresham. There has been handling of the knob within 48 hours. That is hardly surprising, perhaps, except that a man who bolts himself in and has no visitors should produce little such effect. Inspector Gresham looked unconvinced. The servants open it in the morning. Dust settles. Hands touch. It proves nothing. Holmes's reply was mild, but edged with certainty. It proves that an observation has been made. Whether it proves more depends upon what else we find to match it. He moved toward the door. Come, Watson, let us see this corridor. We ascended once more. The passage outside the chamber was long and narrow. Its walls hung with portraits of stern Pembrokes, staring down through varnished gloom. The carpet runner was thick and of dark maroon, designed, one might think, to swallow disturbances. Holmes knelt, his nose almost level with the pile, and moved slowly along, inch by inch, like a hound upon a faint scent. There are no obvious footprints, I observed. Of course not, said Holmes. The carpet is chosen precisely for that purpose. It is forgiving to the eye, yet the carpet itself cannot forget pressure. He produced a small pocket torch and cast its beam obliquely across the surface. Under that slanting light, the pile revealed subtle variations. Areas where the fibers lay differently, where they had been compressed and risen again. Holmes's finger traced a faint line along the runner, nothing one could call a track, and yet suggestive of something repeated. See here, he murmured. I bent closer. The pattern was almost imperceptible, a slight flattening along the right-hand edge, as if a person had habitually walked close to the wall. That is merely the servant's path, I said. Holmes's glance flickered to me with a hint of amusement. Very good, Watson. And now ask yourself, why would servants habitually walk here, in a corridor said to be unused at night? I felt a stir of unease. The corridor, by Hale's testimony, was as quiet as a tomb. Holmes rose and examined the skirting boards. His eyes halted upon a spot near the doorframe. A faint scuff, pale against the dark wood. He touched it. A trace of chalky grit adhered to his fingertip. The same sand, he said softly. Cartwheel Street again. Inspector Gresham, who had followed us reluctantly, leaned forward. Are you suggesting that someone stood here with sand on their shoes? I suggest that someone stood here recently enough for the mark to remain, replied Holmes, and that they carried with them the dust of a particular street. It is a small thing, Inspector, but small things are the only things which do not lie. He turned his attention to the door itself. The knob bore, as Hale had said, a faint dulling. Holmes sniffed it delicately, an odd action perhaps, but one which I had learned never to question. A trace of something, he murmured. Oil, not the heavy furniture polish employed downstairs. A lighter oil, such as one uses for metalwork. Gresham frowned. You think the knob was oiled? Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon the brass. I think the latch was stubborn. Someone wished it to slide smoothly, or wished it to slide without sound. A quiet tension stole over me. The image of the silent chamber returned. The drawn curtains, the cold hearth, the roses standing like an accusation. And yet, I said, Hale swears no visitor entered. Holmes turned toward me, his voice low. And I do not accuse him of falsehood, Watson, but I would remind you that oaths are but the verbal shape of belief. A man may swear truly and still conceal the truth from himself. We returned downstairs, where Hale awaited us in the morning room. His face drawn and haunted. Holmes regarded him for a long moment. Mr. Hale, said he gently, you are afraid. Hale's lips trembled. No, sir. Yes, you are, and fear is a poor counselor. Tell me plainly, did your master ever instruct you to deny the presence of visitors? Hale's eyes filled suddenly. He looked like a man at the brink of confession. He told me, sir, he whispered, that if anyone asked, I was to say he had been alone. Always alone. He said it was for his peace. Holmes nodded, as though a piece had clicked into place. And you obeyed. I had to, sir. He paid me well. He was good to my mother when she was ill. Holmes raised a hand. Enough. Loyalty is admirable, Mr. Hale, but it may become complicit when it blinds itself. You have told me what I needed. Inspector Gresham's voice hardened. So he did have visitors. Hale shook his head wildly. Not visitors, sir. Not. At least, not here. Not that I saw. Holmes's gaze softened again, but his words were firm. Then someone came unseen. Someone whose passage left no obvious mark, whose presence was denied by habit, and whose token was these roses. He turned to me as we left the room. The servant's oath, he said quietly, is sincere, which is precisely why it is dangerous. A frightened man does not invent a lie. He clings to a command. We must discover who issued that command and why. Outside, the fog had thickened, muffling the world into a blur of grey shapes and distant carriage wheels. The roses in the silent chamber seemed, in my mind, to bloom more vividly than ever against such testimony, defiant, impossible, and inexorable. And I knew then, as Holmes knew, that the case had moved beyond the boundaries of a simple locked-room death. It had entered the darker country of hidden meetings, enforced silences, and secrets kept not by cleverness alone, but by fear. Chapter 4 Fay, A Life in Retreat. Holmes has often remarked to me that a crime may be read backward as well as forward, that one must look not merely at the corpse upon the bed, but at the life which led the victim there. In the case of Alistair Pembroke, the locked chamber was not an isolated curiosity, but the culmination of a long retreat, a slow, deliberate withdrawal from the world until the world was reduced to four walls, a bolted door, and the silent companionship of his own apprehensions. It was in the study on the first floor that Holmes set about reconstructing that retreat. The room was somber and disciplined, furnished with the severe taste of a man who valued order more than comfort. Bookcases lined the walls, their shelves filled not with poetry or novels, but with ledgers, shipping manifests, and volumes on trade, chemistry, and mechanical invention. A brass shaded lamp stood upon the desk. Beside it lay an array of sealed letters, neatly stacked as if their very presence offended him. Holmes selected one at random and turned it over without breaking the seal. Unopened, he observed. All of them. A habit. Mr. Pembroke. Edmund Pembroke, who had remained with us, nodded with visible reluctance. My brother ceased to correspond. At first he answered letters, then he delayed, then he stopped altogether. He said that words were merely nets cast by other men, and he would not be caught. Holmes's eyes moved to the stack again, a poetic metaphor for one so practical. He became odd, Edmund admitted. Not mad, but fixed, as if some part of him had been injured and would not heal. Holmes seated himself at the desk and drew one of the ledgers toward him. It was heavy, bound in worn leather, and when he opened it, the air seemed to change subtly, as though the book released the dust of old transactions and buried quarrels. "This is not a gentleman's household account," said he. "This is commerce." "Yes," replied Edmund. "Alistair was a trader. He had an enterprise." Holmes's finger traced a column of figures. He paused at a name and tapped it once with the nail. "Caro." Udman's face tightened at once. "That name is not spoken here." Holmes's gaze lifted calm and unwavering. "Then it is precisely the name which must be spoken." Inspector Gresham had joined us, his patience thinning with each turn of the case into regions less tangible than footprints and locks. Yet even he seemed to sense that the house itself trembled under the weight of that word. "Edwin Caro," Edmund said at last, as if conceding to a necessity. "He was my brother's partner. They built Pembroke and Caro together, imported goods, rare materials. Alistair was the careful one, the methodical one. Caro was bold, charming, too bold." "And the partnership collapsed," Holmes said. "It did 2 years ago. There were accusations, terrible accusations." Holmes closed the ledger gently. "Tell me," Edmund paced to the window and looked out upon the fog, as though he could not bear to meet Holmes's eyes while he spoke. "They dealt in imported goods, spices, dyes, certain chemical compounds, not unlawful in themselves, but valuable. A great deal of money passed through their hands. One season the accounts began to show irregularities. Shipments vanished. Payments were delayed. Alistair believed Caro was diverting funds, embezzling perhaps." "Was he?" asked Gresham bluntly. Edmund's hands clenched behind his back. "Alistair thought so. Caro denied it. They quarreled violently. There were lawyers, threats of court. Then Caro vanished from London." Holmes's expression remained composed. "Vanished. He left in disgrace, or so it was said. No formal charge was brought, because my brother," Edmund hesitated, then spoke with bitterness, "because my brother could never quite prove it." Holmes's eyes sharpened, and yet he believed it, with all his soul. "And what became of Caro?" "We heard he went abroad. Some said Antwerp, others Lisbon. There were rumors of debt, of gambling, of ruin, but nothing certain. He was a man who could slip away from consequences as easily as he slipped away from London." Holmes sat back in his chair. "A man who disappears leaves behind two things, those who hate him and those who fear his return." Edmund's voice dropped. "Alistair feared him, more than he hated him." Holmes's gaze moved once more to the unopened letters. "And thus your brother withdrew." "Yes, at first he merely refused invitations. Then he stopped attending his clubs. Then he ceased to receive visitors. He dismissed half the household. He would not travel. He would not go to the theater. He would not even walk in the park." Holmes rose and began to examine the desk drawers. They contained more ledgers, a set of keys, and a locked wooden box. Holmes did not attempt to open it, but he weighed it in his hand, as if judging its contents by balance alone. "Did he ever speak of Caro after the dispute?" "Only once," Edmund said. "He told me, 'A man who steals your gold may be forgiven, but a man who steals your trust returns for the remainder.'" Holmes's face remained impassive, but I saw the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, which signaled interest. "A prudent sentiment," he murmured. Inspector Gresham shifted. "If Caro had motive, why no charge? Why no watch kept?" Holmes looked at him. "Because motive is not evidence. Inspector, and because Mr. Pembroke built his watch into the very architecture of his life. We went upstairs again, not to the death chamber, but to the adjoining dressing room, which had been spared the disturbance of the forced entry. Holmes surveyed it with that uncanny ability to draw character from surroundings. The clothing was plain, severe. Shoes were lined precisely, each pair polished to the same dull shine. A heavy winter coat hung untouched. There was no scent of cologne, no ornaments, no indulgence. A life in retreat, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. A life narrowed to essentials. When a man distrusts the world, he begins to distrust his own pleasures. He opened the wardrobe and examined the garments closely. His fingers paused at the cuffs of a black frock coat dust. He murmured, "Fine soot, normal." But here, he lifted the sleeve to the light. A faint smear, chalky. Street sand again, I asked. Number, this is finer. Almost powder, lime, perhaps. He set the coat aside and turned to Hale, who had been summoned again. "Thomas Hale," Holmes said. "Your master's routine in the evening, describe it precisely." Hale's nervousness returned at once, but he answered faithfully. He would retire to his chamber, sir. He would read. Sometimes he would write. Sometimes he would walk the floor for an hour. He always bolted the door. He always drew the curtains. And he always requested that the fire be allowed to die, Holmes added, recalling the servant's earlier statement. "Yes, sir." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Hale swallowed. "He said a warm room made him restless, sir. He said heat made the air thick." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me, and I felt a stir of unease. A cold room, drawn curtains, a bolted door. A man seeking not comfort but control. "Did he ever complain of smells?" Holmes asked suddenly. Hale blinked. "Smells, sir." "Yes. Perfume, flowers, smoke." Hale hesitated. He disliked perfume, sir. He would tell the maids not to use strong soaps once. When a guest brought lilies, he ordered them removed at once. He said the scent gave him headaches. Holmes's face grew thoughtful. "And yet he died beside roses." Hale's lips trembled. "Yes, sir." Holmes dismissed him with a nod and turned to Edmund. "Your brother's chamber," said he, "was both refuge and prison. The habits you describe, bolting, sealing, refusing correspondence, were not mere eccentricities, they were defenses." Edmund's voice was strained. "Against what?" Holmes did not answer at once. He walked slowly to the window, drew aside the curtain, and looked out upon the foggy square. Then he spoke very quietly. "Against the return of Edwin Carrow." Inspector Gresham made an impatient sound. "Speculation." Holmes turned, his eyes clear. "Inference, Inspector. We have a man who withdrew abruptly after a betrayal in business. He ceased to trust all but his servant. He refused letters unopened, a sure sign that he feared not the content, but the very act of receiving. He sealed himself nightly in a cold, dark chamber. Such a man is not merely reclusive. He is vigilant." Edmund's voice was barely above a whisper. "You believe Carrow came back?" Holmes' gaze rested upon him. "I believe," he said, "that your brother expected someone at 11:30. We have seen the impression on the paper he wrote, as agreed alone. That is not the message of a man surprised by intrusion. It is the message of a man obeying a private arrangement." Edmund sank into a chair, his face pale. "But Carrow, if he returned, why not confront him? Why meet him alone?" Holmes's voice grew softer, more human. "Because fear is not always loud, Mr. Pembroke. Sometimes it is quiet and methodical. A man who builds walls high enough may forget what walks unseen within them." He crossed again to the desk, where the locked wooden box lay. He turned it over and examined the hinges. "This box has been opened recently," he observed. "The brass shows fresh friction, yet the dust on the desk around it is undisturbed, which suggests it has been opened in this room, not moved elsewhere." Inspector Gresham leaned forward. "What's inside?" Holmes's smile was thin, something Mr. Pembroke valued enough to lock away. Perhaps the key to his fear, perhaps the key to his death. He returned the box to its place without attempting to force it. "Not yet," he murmured, as if speaking to the object itself. "We shall not steal your secrets. We shall persuade you to reveal them." That afternoon, Holmes insisted upon visiting Mr. Pembroke's solicitor, and it was there, in a narrow office off Chancery Lane, that the outline of the past dispute took sharper shape. Mr. Carruthers proved to be a dry, pale man with an ink-stained thumb and the cautious manner of one who has seen too much human folly to be surprised by it. "Caro," Carruthers said with distaste. "A brilliant scoundrel. He had charm enough to sell a man his own watch and make him thank you for the bargain. Pembroke was the opposite. Honest, stiff, precise. They were bound to clash. And the embezzlement?" Holmes asked. Carruthers pursed his lips. There were discrepancies considerable. Pembroke suspected Caro. I advised caution. We lacked proof sufficient for court. Caro departed before the matter could be resolved. And Pembroke never recovered. Carruthers sighed. He did not. He became, how shall I put it, a man besieged. He feared blackmail. He feared exposure. Not for his own wrongdoing, mind you, but for the mere association with Caro. He believed that Caro would one day return to demand something. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Demand what? Carruthers hesitated. Money, most likely, or silence, or some document. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. A document, he repeated softly. When we returned to Baker Street that evening, the fog had thickened into a yellow pall, and the gas lamps shone like blurred stars. Holmes sat at the table, his pipe unlit, his eyes fixed upon nothing. "A man who retreats," he said at last, "does not do so for sport. He retreats because he has been driven. Pembroke built his walls and bolted his doors. But the roses tell us that something passed those walls. Something walked into that chamber and left again, without leaving so much as a footprint in the carpet." "And Caro?" I asked. "Is he your prime suspect?" Holmes's mouth tightened. "Caro is a shadow from the past. Shadows may kill, but they more often conceal those who do." He rose abruptly and began to pace, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "We must find Edwin Caro," he said. "Not because he is certainly the murderer, but because Pembroke's fear of him was real enough to shape his life, and perhaps to shape his death. If Caro returned, he did not come for roses." Holmes's eyes flashed toward me. He came for something Pembroke kept locked away, and whatever it was, it has now become the true treasure of this case. The chamber in which Pembroke died had been a sanctuary built against the world, yet the world had reached him anyway. Quietly, methodically, and with the scent of crimson roses lingering like a taunt in the air. Chapter V. Fay, the hidden panel. It was in the late afternoon, when the fog had thickened outside Pembroke House into a yellowish pall, and the gas lamps along the square had begun to burn with that blurred, watery glow peculiar to London winters, that Holmes returned to the death chamber and shut the door behind us with an air of finality. "Inspector Gresham," said he, "I shall ask you for a courtesy." The inspector, whose patience had been stretched by hours of what he termed philosophy, raised his brows. "And that is, that you will keep your men from this passage for the next quarter of an hour, and permit me to be alone with my thoughts." Gresham's mustaches bristled. Alone, in the very room where Holmes's voice was mild, but there was iron beneath it. "If you prefer, Inspector, you may stand at the door and watch me think, but you will find it a tedious spectacle." Gresham flushed and made a curt gesture of assent. "Very well, but I shall remain within call." When the inspector had withdrawn and the door had clicked shut, the chamber seemed to settle into an even deeper silence than before, as though it resented intrusion. The drawn curtains swallowed the light, leaving the air dim and thick. The roses upon the bedside table burned like a small, defiant flame of color. Holmes stood for a moment, unmoving, and I saw once more that peculiar transformation, the languid man of society vanishing, the hunter appearing. His eyes traveled over the room with the steadiness of a measuring instrument. "You have something," I said. "I have a question," he replied, "and questions are more valuable." He began to walk slowly and methodically about the perimeter of the chamber. His steps were almost noiseless upon the carpet. His long fingers traced the carved wainscot beneath the faded wallpaper, moving with the delicacy of a blind man reading raised letters. I watched, fascinated, as he examined the room not as a place, but as an arrangement of possibilities. The wardrobe, the desk, the bed, the hearth. Each was, in his mind, an element in a problem. I understood at last why he had refused to open the locked wooden box earlier. Holmes did not seize at secrets. He waited until the world itself offered the key. He paused at the hearth, sniffed once more at the cold ashes, then moved on. At the window, he drew back the curtain by a fraction, examined the latch, and let it fall again. "No," he murmured, almost irritably. "Number." Then he struck a match. The small flame flared, and in that momentary light his face took on a sculpted sharpness, the hollows beneath his cheekbones dark and severe. He held the match at various points along the wall, watching not the wainscot, but the flame itself, its steadiness, its tremor, its inclination. At first it burned upright, then near the far corner beside the wardrobe, it flickered. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He struck another match and held it in the same place. Again the flame trembled and leaned, as if brushed by an unseen breath. "There is a draught," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "But the windows are sealed, and the chimney admits no wind." "How?" He extinguished the match and ran his fingertips over the paneling once more slowly now, pressing at intervals with calculated firmness. His touch was not random, but guided, as though he followed an inner map of construction and joinery. "There are two kinds of concealment," he said as he worked. "One is crude, concealment by darkness and disorder. The other is refined, concealment by ordinary appearance. A hidden door is most invisible when it seems to be merely a wall." His fingers paused. He pressed again. The wood yielded, only the slightest fraction, as if it shifted under pressure. Holmes's posture altered at once. He became utterly still, like a hound that has scented quarry. "There," he said softly. I stepped closer. To my eye, the wainscot appeared unbroken, carved oak panels, aged and polished, running in neat sections around the room. Yet when Holmes placed both palms flat upon one narrow segment and applied steady pressure, I felt, rather than saw, a subtle movement. With a faint click, a narrow section gave way. A thin panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a concealed aperture scarcely wider than a coffin board. Beyond it yawned a cramped passage of rough timber and stone. Cold air breathed steadily from its depths, carrying with it a faint odor. Damp earth and old wood, the smell of places long closed. The sealed room, it seemed, had lungs. Holmes held his match up and peered into the opening. The flame leaned sharply inward, drawn by the current. "A service passage," he murmured. "Or a contrivance for concealment. Either way, it answers our paradox." I felt an involuntary tightening in my chest. Then someone could enter and leave without using the door. Exactly. Holmes leaned in, examining the frame. "Note the workmanship. The hinge is well oiled. The edges are rubbed clean. This panel has been opened recently and often, yet the household swore the room was sealed." He glanced toward me, his eyes bright with that quiet excitement, which is in Holmes the nearest approach to joy. "Our servant's oath, Watson, was sincere. He spoke of the door and the windows. He did not speak of the walls." I bent to look into the passage. It was narrow, scarcely allowing a man to squeeze through. The rough timber framing suggested it had been added after the house's construction. There were scrape marks along the side, pale lines where cloth or shoulders had brushed repeatedly. Holmes observed them as well. "A man of slight build could traverse this easily," he said. "A larger man would leave deeper abrasion." "And where does it lead?" I asked. Holmes's reply was immediate. "We shall see." He produced from his pocket a small lantern, one of those ingenious folding models which he carried as other men might carry a handkerchief. With a soft snap it opened, and he lit it with a match, shielding the flame with his hand. "Come," he said, and without hesitation he lowered himself into the aperture. I followed, less gracefully, my shoulders brushing the timber. The cold air was stronger within, and the silence deeper. A silence not of a furnished room, but of a hollow space behind walls, where sound is swallowed by wood and stone. The passage ran straight for several yards, then turned sharply. Holmes moved with astonishing confidence for a man in such confined quarters, his lantern held low, his head bent. "Observe," he said. "The floorboards are newer than the house. The timber has been reinforced. This is not the work of a casual trespasser. It has been built deliberately." "Built by whom?" I whispered. Holmes's voice came back, low and controlled. "By a man with motive to enter unseen, or by a man with motive to keep something unseen." We reached the first turn. The passage widened slightly, enough for us to stand more comfortably. Holmes held the lantern to the wall, revealing a series of chalk marks, faint irregular symbols like the careless notation of a workman. "Carpenter's marks," Holmes observed. "Not recent. This passage may have existed for years." "Then Pembroke knew of it," I said. Holmes's lantern light caught the side of his face as he turned. "Not necessarily. Many houses possess forgotten spaces, servant passages, disused chimneys, concealed cupboards. The question is whether Mr. Pembroke discovered it and used it, or whether someone else used it against him." He moved on. After another turn, the passage began to slope downward. The air grew damper. The smell of earth intensified. At last we reached a point where the passage ended in another concealed panel, smaller still. Holmes listened at it, his ear pressed against the wood. For a moment he remained motionless. Then he smiled faintly. "Voices," he murmured. "Downstairs." He pressed, and the panel yielded. We emerged, not into a grand corridor, but into a narrow closet behind a row of hanging coats. Holmes parted the garments and peered through a crack. We were, I realized with astonishment, behind the wall of the servants' passage on the first floor. From our concealed vantage, we could see the dim corridor outside, and beyond it the stairway leading down. A maid passed, carrying linens, utterly unaware that a hidden aperture watched her. Holmes stepped back into the closet and closed the panel again, leaving us in darkness broken only by the lantern's glow. "So," I whispered, "the passage connects the chamber to the servants' side of the house." Holmes nodded slowly, and thus the roses traveled. Thus the visitor entered. Thus the door could remain bolted and the windows sealed. "But who would build such a passage?" I asked, "and why?" Holmes's face was grave now. Those are the questions which turn a trick into a crime. He knelt and examined the closet floor. Dust lay thick, undisturbed in the corners, yet along the center there was a narrow path where dust had been scuffed away by repeated footsteps. Holmes touched it, then held his finger to the lantern light. "Cartwheel Street, sand," he said softly. "The same pale grit. Our unseen traveler has walked here." A faint sound reached us then, soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into darkness. "What is it?" I whispered. Holmes's voice was barely audible. "Listen." The sound came again, tap, tap. Tap not from the corridor outside. Not from above. It came from within the wall itself, from somewhere deeper in the hidden structure, as though another passage branched off from ours. Holmes's hand closed lightly around my wrist, a rare gesture of caution. "There are other lungs to this house," he murmured, "and someone may be breathing in them even now." For several minutes we remained motionless. Listening, the tapping ceased. Silence returned. Holmes relit the lantern, but his expression had changed. The discovery of the hidden panel had answered one mystery, but it had opened another, more troubling because it suggested not merely access but surveillance. We retraced our way through the passage and emerged once more into the death chamber. Holmes replaced the panel, pressing it until it clicked into perfect invisibility. He then struck a final match and held it near the wainscot. The flame burned upright, now the draft gone. He turned to me. "The room was sealed, Watson," he said quietly. "You forget, Watson, that footprints are democratic. They reveal no allegiance of sex or rank. This heel is narrower than the average male boot, but not conclusive." He rose and continued. At length, the passage terminated not in a closet, as before, but in a heavier timbered panel set flush against stonework. Holmes extinguished the lantern and pressed his ear to the wood. After a moment, he nodded. "Open air beyond," he said, "and faint traffic, distant carriage wheels." He relit the lantern and applied pressure to the panel. It resisted at first, then yielded with a low creak, revealing a cramped, low-roofed structure smelling of damp rope and old timber. We emerged into what had once been a storage shed at the rear of the property. Its roof sagged slightly. Its windows were boarded from within. A door, secured by a simple latch, faced a narrow alley that ran parallel to the square. Holmes closed the panel carefully behind us, ensuring it blended seamlessly into the shed's inner wall. From this side, the concealed entrance was masked by a stack of wooden crates and a length of canvas sheeting. "A hidden artery," Holmes said quietly, unknown to servant or guest. I looked about the shed. Dust lay thick upon most surfaces, yet near the crates there was a clearer path, as if they had been shifted recently. Holmes knelt and examined the ground. The same pale grit we had found in the vase lay scattered here, in greater quantity. "Cartwheel Street sand," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Tracked from the street, through the alley, and into this shed. The narrow wheels we observed would pass easily over such a surface." He moved to the shed door and lifted the latch. The alley beyond was deserted, its cobbles damp and faintly glistening in the failing light. A thin line of sand had been spread along its center for traction, identical in composition to that found in the vase and along the passage. Holmes stepped out and examined the cobbles closely. Faint wheel tracks, nearly obliterated by later traffic, could be seen leading toward the main road. "What enters unseen," he murmured, "may also depart unseen." I felt a chill independent of the winter air. Then the visitor did not merely come through the passage. He or she brought something. Precisely. Holmes returned to the shed and surveyed it with renewed scrutiny. In one corner stood a wooden packing crate, recently nailed shut. The wood was cleaner than its surroundings, its metal strapping bright. He tapped it lightly. The sound was hollow. "Empty," he said, "but recently occupied." He knelt and examined the floor beside it. There were scratches, fine, parallel marks consistent with the narrow wheels we had observed. "The crate was transported along the passage," Holmes continued, "from the chamber to this shed, or from this shed to the chamber. To what purpose?" I asked. Holmes rose slowly, his expression grave. "That depends upon whether it carried goods or something less negotiable." The thought hung between us. "Pembroke's business dealt in imported materials," I said cautiously. "Rare compounds, chemicals." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Yes, and if those materials were of value or danger, they might be concealed from prying eyes." He walked back to the concealed panel and examined its inner mechanism. A simple latch, operable from either side, had been fitted discreetly within the frame. "No lock," he observed. "Merely discretion. Then anyone who knew of it could pass freely." "Exactly." Holmes's gaze drifted toward the alley once more. If Edwin Carrow returned to London, he might well have sought to avoid the front door. If he wished to meet Pembroke privately, unseen by servants, this passage offered the perfect route. "And the roses?" I pressed. Holmes considered. "They may have served as signal, or apology, or disguise." "Disguise. Yes, if one wished to mask an odor, for example." I stared at him. "An odor." Holmes's voice lowered. "Pembroke disliked strong scents. He requested the fire be extinguished nightly. He sealed his windows. Suppose a visitor introduced into that room some vapor, colorless, subtle, in a confined space, it would act swiftly. The roses might serve to conceal its faint trace." I felt a tightening in my chest. "You suspect poison by gas." Holmes's expression was thoughtful, not triumphant. I suspect nothing yet, but I note that the chamber was cold and sealed, that no wound was found, that no poison bottle was present. And I note that a crate capable of carrying apparatus traveled along this passage. We stood in silence for a moment, the implications settling heavily. At last Holmes spoke again, more quietly. Pembroke built walls against betrayal, but the walls themselves concealed the means by which he might be betrayed again. He turned to me with sudden intensity. Watson, recall the tapping we heard within the wall? Yes. There may be a secondary branch, another chamber connected to this artery. If so, someone could observe the room without entering it directly. The idea was profoundly unsettling. Holmes's gaze hardened. We must map this passage entirely, every inch, every junction. Only then shall we know whether the sealed room was a sanctuary or a stage. He extinguished the lantern once more and stood in the dim shed, listening to the muted sounds of the city beyond the alley. A hidden artery, he repeated softly, and through it, life or death may pass without ever troubling the front door. As we returned through the narrow passage toward the chamber where Pembroke lay, I could not dispel the image of that unseen route connecting private room to public street. The roses had traveled it, the sand had marked it, the crate had rolled upon it, and somewhere within its dark timbers, the answer to the silent chamber waited, patient, deliberate, and as cold as the air that breathed from its depths. Chapter 7. Faye, the florist's trail Cartwheel Street, possessed that curious vitality which persists in London commerce, regardless of weather or circumstance. Though the afternoon lay shrouded in a sallow fog, the shop fronts burned with light and color, their windows crowded with blooms that defied the season, white lilies, hothouse orchids, and, most prominently, the crimson roses whose scent had become inseparable from the memory of the silent chamber. Holmes and I approached the street on foot, the better to observe its character without announcement. The sand strewn along its cobbles for traction lay pale and granular, precisely of the composition Holmes had earlier identified. It glittered faintly beneath the lamps. "You see, Watson," Holmes murmured, pausing to scrape a pinch of it with the tip of his cane. "The same admixture of quartz and chalk, a small thing, but consistency is the mother of certainty." The florists conducted a brisk trade, despite the hour. Apprentices darted in and out with wrapped bouquets. Ladies in veils examined arrangements with delicate scrutiny. Holmes, however, did not stride boldly into the nearest establishment. Instead, he moved from shop to shop with patient discretion, making inquiries in the manner of a gentleman seeking reliable service rather than information. At the third shop, a narrow, fronted establishment with a green-painted door and the sign Weatherby and Son Florists, Holmes's manner altered subtly. He studied the arrangement in the window. A dozen crimson roses, long-stemmed, bound with dark ribbon. "Observe the cut," he whispered. "Diagonal, clean and thorns stripped below the midstem, precisely as in Pembroke's chamber." He entered. The interior was warm and fragrant, the air heavy with moisture from recently watered blooms. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a tidy beard and a manner at once cautious and obliging. "Good afternoon," Holmes began pleasantly. "I am in search of a particular arrangement. Crimson roses, 12 in number without ribbon, delivered perhaps 2 days past to Kensington." The florist regarded him thoughtfully. "We send many roses to Kensington, sir. I do not doubt it, but this order was placed in person, paid in coin, exact coin, if memory serves, and requested no card be attached." A flicker of recognition passed over the man's face before he could suppress it. Holmes saw it. "Yes," the florist said slowly. "I recall such an order. A gentleman came near closing time, insisted upon those very specifications." Holmes's voice remained light. "And the address? Pembroke House, in the square." My pulse quickened. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if the information merely confirmed a trivial expectation. "You delivered them?" "I did not. The gentleman took them himself." Holmes's eyes sharpened, though his tone did not change. He carried them away. "Yes, sir," said he, preferred to ensure they arrived fresh. Holmes nodded. You recall his appearance? The florist hesitated, glancing about as though uncertain of the propriety of such recollection. A tall gentleman, he said at last, wore a dark overcoat, good quality broad hat, kept it low, spoke little. His voice was educated. Anything else? The man frowned, searching memory. Nothing remarkable save, yes. There was a faint scar along his jaw, left side. If I recall correctly, a thin white line near the ear. Holmes did not move for several seconds. His eyes remained fixed upon the florist. Yet something within them had changed, a subtle tightening, like the drawing of a bowstring. Indeed, he said quietly. You are certain of the scar? As certain as I can be, sir. It caught my eye when he turned toward the light. Holmes withdrew a coin and placed it upon the counter with deliberate care. You have been most helpful. As we stepped back into the street, the fog seemed less a curtain than a veil drawn aside. You recognize him, I said. Holmes's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the certainty within it. I do. Widwin Carrow. Holmes inclined his head. Tracked from the street through the alley and into this shed. The narrow wheels we observed would pass easily over such a surface. He moved to the shed door and lifted the latch. The alley beyond was deserted, its cobbles damp and faintly glistening in the failing light. A thin line of sand had been spread along its center for traction, identical in composition to that found in the vase and along the passage. Holmes stepped out and examined the cobbles closely. Faint wheel tracks, nearly obliterated by later traffic, could be seen leading toward the main road. What enters unseen, he murmured, may also depart unseen. I felt a chill independent of the winter air. Then the visitor did not merely come through the passage. He or she brought something. Precisely. Holmes returned to the shed and surveyed it with renewed scrutiny. In one corner stood a wooden packing crate, recently nailed shut. The wood was cleaner than its surroundings, its metal strapping bright. He tapped it lightly. The sound was hollow. Empty, he said, but recently occupied. He knelt and examined the floor beside it. There were scratches, fine parallel marks consistent with the narrow wheels we had observed. The crate was transported along the passage. Holmes continued, from the chamber to this shed, or from this shed to the chamber. To what purpose? I asked. Holmes rose slowly, his expression grave. That depends upon whether it carried goods, or something less negotiable. The thought hung between us. Pembroke's business dealt in imported materials, I said cautiously. Rare compounds, chemicals. Holmes's eyes flickered. Yes, and if those materials were of value or danger, they might be concealed from prying eyes. He walked back to the concealed panel and examined its inner mechanism. A simple latch, operable from either side, had been fitted discreetly within the frame. No lock, he observed. Merely discretion. Then anyone who knew of it could pass freely. Exactly. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the alley once more. If Edwin Carrow returned to London, he might well have sought to avoid the front door. If he wished to meet Pembroke privately, unseen by servants, this passage offered the perfect route. And the roses? I pressed, Holmes considered. They may have served as signal, or apology, or disguise. Disguise. Yes, if one wished to mask an odor, for example. I stared at him. An odor? Holmes's voice lowered. Pembroke disliked strong scents. He requested the fire be extinguished nightly. He sealed his windows. Suppose a visitor introduced into that room, some vapor, colorless, subtle, in a confined space. It would act swiftly. The roses might serve to conceal its faint trace. I felt a tightening in my chest. You suspect poison by gas. Holmes's expression was thoughtful, not triumphant. I suspect nothing yet, but I note that the chamber was cold and sealed, that no wound was found, that no poison bottle was present, and I note that a crate capable of carrying apparatus traveled along this passage. We stood in silence for a moment, the implications settling heavily. At last Holmes spoke again, more quietly. Pembroke built walls against betrayal. But the walls themselves concealed the means by which he might be betrayed again. He turned to me with sudden intensity. "Watson, recall the tapping we heard within the wall." "Yes. There may be a secondary branch, another chamber connected to this artery. If so, someone could observe the room without entering it directly." The idea was profoundly unsettling. Holmes's gaze hardened. "We must map this passage entirely, every inch, every junction. Only then shall we know whether the sealed room was a sanctuary or a stage." He extinguished the lantern once more and stood in the dim shed, listening to the muted sounds of the city beyond the alley. "A hidden artery," he repeated softly, "and through it, life or death may pass without ever troubling the front door." As we returned through the narrow passage toward the chamber where Pembroke lay, I could not dispel the image of that unseen route, connecting private room to public street. The roses had traveled it. The sand had marked it. The crate had rolled upon it. And somewhere within its dark timbers, the answer to the silent chamber waited, patient, deliberate, and as cold as the air that breathed from its depths. Chapter 7 The florist's trail Cartwheel Street possessed that curious vitality which persists in London commerce, regardless of weather or circumstance. Though the afternoon lay shrouded in a sallow fog, the shop fronts burned with light and color, their windows crowded with blooms that defied the season. White lilies, hothouse, orchids, and, most prominently, the crimson roses whose scent had become inseparable from the memory of the silent chamber. Holmes and I approached the street on foot, the better to observe its character without announcement. The sand strewn along its cobbles for traction lay pale and granular, precisely of the composition Holmes had earlier identified. It glittered faintly beneath the lamps. "You see, Watson," Holmes murmured, pausing to scrape a pinch of it with the tip of his cane. "The same admixture of quartz and chalk. A small thing, but consistency is the mother of certainty." The florists conducted a brisk trade despite the hour. Apprentices darted in and out with wrapped bouquets. Ladies in veils examined arrangements with delicate scrutiny. Holmes, however, did not stride boldly into the nearest establishment. Instead, he moved from shop to shop with patient discretion, making inquiries in the manner of a gentleman seeking reliable service rather than information. At the third shop, a narrow, fronted establishment with a green, painted door and the sign Weatherby and Son Florists, Holmes's manner altered subtly. He studied the arrangement in the window. A dozen crimson roses, long-stemmed, bound with dark ribbon. "Observe the cut," he whispered. "Diagonal, clean, and thorns stripped below the mid-stem, precisely as in Pembroke's chamber." He entered. The interior was warm and fragrant, the air heavy with moisture from recently watered blooms. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a tidy beard, and a manner at once cautious and obliging. "Good afternoon," Holmes began pleasantly. "I am in search of a particular arrangement. Crimson roses, 12 in number, without ribbon. Delivered, perhaps, 2 days past to Kensington." The florist regarded him thoughtfully. "We send many roses to Kensington, sir. I do not doubt it, but this order was placed in person, paid in coin, exact coin, if memory serves, and requested no card be attached." A flicker of recognition passed over the man's face before he could suppress it. Holmes saw it. "Yes," the florist said slowly. "I recall such an order. A gentleman came near closing time, insisted upon those very specifications." Holmes's voice remained light. "And the address? Pembroke House in the square." My pulse quickened. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if the information merely confirmed a trivial expectation. "I did not. The gentleman took them himself." Holmes's eyes sharpened, though his tone did not change. "He carried them away." "Yes, sir," said he preferred, to ensure they arrived, fresh. Holmes nodded. "You recall his appearance?" The florist hesitated, glancing about as though uncertain of the propriety of such recollection. "A tall gentleman," he said at last. "Wore a dark overcoat, good quality broad hat, kept it low, spoke little. His voice was educated." "Anything else?" The man frowned, searching memory. Nothing remarkable save, yes, there was a faint scar along his jaw, left side, if I recall correctly. A thin white line near the ear. Holmes did not move for several seconds. His eyes remained fixed upon the florist, yet something within them had changed, a subtle tightening, like the drawing of a bowstring. "Indeed," he said quietly, "you are certain of the scar." "As certain as I can be, sir." It caught my eye when he turned toward the light. Holmes withdrew a coin and placed it upon the counter with deliberate care. "You have been most helpful." As we stepped back into the street, the fog seemed less a curtain than a veil drawn aside. "You recognize him," I said. Holmes's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the certainty within it. "I do. Widwin Caro." Holmes inclined his head. I recalled at once the solicitor's description, the charming scoundrel, the vanished partner. And now the image formed clearly, a tall man, precise in payment, cautious in speech, marked by a scar. "You've seen him before," I pressed. Holmes replied. "At the height of the dispute between Pembroke and Caro, the scar was then recent. A fencing accident, if memory serves. He wore it lightly, almost proudly. And now he wears it again in Cartwheel Street." Yes, Holmes began to walk slowly along the cobbles, his cane tapping lightly. I followed. "The roses were purchased 2 days prior," he continued, "which suggests the meeting with Pembroke was arranged in advance. The message impressed upon the desk. 11:30, as agreed, alone, confirms it." "But why roses?" I asked. If Caro intended harm, why announce himself with flowers? Holmes's gaze was distant, contemplative. "Because roses speak in more than one language, Watson. They may signify apology or mockery. They may conceal scent. They may serve as token of reconciliation. Caro is not a brute. He is theatrical." "And the exact coin," I said. "You noted that particularly." Holmes smiled faintly. "A man who pays in exact coin seeks to leave no memory of transaction beyond the necessary. No change to be recalled. No banknote to be traced. It is the habit of one accustomed to careful dealings." We turned into the alley behind Cartwheel Street, following the line which would lead, eventually, toward the rear of Pembroke House. "The crate," I said. "If Caro purchased roses, might he also have conveyed something else?" Holmes nodded. "It is probable. The narrow wheels in the passage suggest apparatus or container. Roses alone would not require such conveyance." Then he came prepared. "Yes." We paused at a corner where the alley bent toward the square. Holmes examined the cobbles minutely. Among the countless impressions of traffic, he pointed to a faint, double-grooved line. "There," he said. The marks were subtle, nearly obliterated by later movement, yet discernible to the trained eye, parallel tracks, 18 inches apart. "The same width as in the passage," I observed. Holmes nodded. From Cartwheel Street to the shed, the crate traveled openly through the alley. No one questions a delivery cart. And from the shed into the hidden corridor. Precisely. We stood in silence a moment, contemplating the quiet geometry of the crime. Purchase, passage, chamber. "What troubles you?" I asked. For Holmes's expression had grown more thoughtful than triumphant. He spoke slowly. If Caro wished to kill Pembroke, he possessed motive, resentment, perhaps blackmail. He possessed means, the hidden passage. He possessed opportunity, an arranged meeting. Yet motive, means, and opportunity do not always equate to guilt. "You doubt him." "I doubt simplicity," Holmes replied. "Caro is bold, but not reckless. To murder a man in his own house, then depart by secret passage, such an act requires confidence that suspicion will not readily fall upon him. But it must, I insisted, once we reveal his return." Holmes interrupted gently. "To whom?" The florist saw only a gentleman with a scar. The servant saw no visitor. Caro's departure from London years ago renders him almost mythic. Without direct proof, he remains a shadow. And yet you are certain it was he. Holmes's eyes met mine. I am certain that the man who purchased those roses bore Edwin Carrow's scar. Whether that man is the murderer is another matter. We resumed our walk toward Pembroke House. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the outlines of chimneys and rooftops against a dimming sky. "Holmes," I said, "if Carrow returned to confront Pembroke, what might he have sought?" Holmes's reply came without hesitation. "Leverage. The locked wooden box," I said at once. "Exactly." We reached the rear of the property and paused beside the sagging shed which concealed the hidden artery. Holmes regarded it with quiet intensity. Carrow purchases roses. He conveys a crate through the alley. He enters by the shed, passes through the corridor, and meets Pembroke in the chamber. The door remains bolted, the windows sealed. Something occurs within. Pembroke dies. Carrow departs unseen. He turned to me. That is the narrative most convenient to our present evidence. And yet, Holmes's gaze hardened. And yet the roses were placed beside the bed, not abandoned upon the floor. The water was fresh. The arrangement deliberate. That suggests not haste, but composure, meaning. Meaning that whoever left that room after Pembroke's death did so calmly. I felt a chill. Then Carrow is cold-blooded indeed. Or, Holmes said softly, "Summoning wishes us to think so." We entered the house by the front this time. Inspector Gresham met us in the hall, his expression expectant. "Well," he demanded. Holmes removed his gloves with unhurried precision. "The roses were purchased in person 2 days ago," he said, "by a tall gentleman in a dark overcoat and broad hat. He bore a faint scar along his left jaw." Gresham's eyes widened. "You know him?" Holmes's reply was measured. "I know of him. Edwin Carrow has returned to London." The name seemed to reverberate in the hall like a struck bell. Edmund Pembroke, who stood nearby, went visibly pale. "Carrow," he whispered. "Impossible." Holmes's gaze rested upon him, steady and unreadable. "On the contrary, Mr. Pembroke," he said quietly. "It is entirely possible. The past has a habit of revisiting those who believe themselves secure from it." Inspector Gresham's jaw tightened. "Then we have our man." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward the staircase leading to the silent chamber. "Perhaps," he said. "But until we understand precisely what passed between Edwin Carrow and Alistair Pembroke at 11:30 on that final night, we possess only a name and a trail of roses." As we ascended once more, I could not dispel the image of the tall gentleman in the dark overcoat, his scar pale against the lamplight. Selecting crimson roses with exact coin, Edwin Carrow had returned. But whether he had come as penitent, blackmailer, or murderer remained a question whose answer lay still hidden within the narrow lungs of Pembroke House. Chapter the 8th. The method of murder. We returned once more to the upper chamber. And as the door closed behind us, the familiar hush settled like a weight. The room had become, in my mind, less a place than a proposition, a sealed space in which the laws of ordinary intrusion had been suspended. Yet now that Holmes had discovered its hidden lungs, the mystery had shifted. The question was no longer how a man could die alone in a bolted room, but how another could enter, kill, and depart, leaving behind the appearance of solitude. Holmes moved first to the bedside table, but not to admire the roses. He lifted them with the same measured disgust one might show an object contaminated by intention. He sniffed once briefly, then set the vase down and turned toward the body with the air of a surgeon approaching an operation. "Inspector Gresham," he said, "I must ask you to permit me a more thorough examination than your men have yet undertaken." Gresham, chastened by the discovery of the passage, merely nodded. "Do what you must." Holmes drew back the bedclothes carefully. The corpse lay as before, hands at the sides, limbs aligned, no obvious sign of violence. Yet in the dim light I perceived what I had overlooked earlier. The muscles of the face were not slack in peace, but fixed in something nearer to alarm. The mouth was slightly open, the brows faintly drawn. "Fear," I murmured. Holmes's eyes did not leave the dead man's features. "Sudden fear," he corrected. "Not prolonged. or you would see agitation in the bedding, torn cloth, a displacement of limbs. Here there is no struggle. Therefore the terror came too late, or the body too quickly failed to respond. He bent low, examining the lips, the nostrils, the eyelids. Then he turned his attention to the throat. His fingers moved with extraordinary delicacy, pressing, releasing, tracing the faint contours beneath the skin. "There," he said softly. I leaned closer. At first I saw nothing but the pallor of death. Then, under the slant of Holmes's lantern, a faint discoloration emerged. 2-minute bruises, scarcely larger than a pinhead, just beneath the jawline. Holmes produced his lens and held it to the marks. "Minute bruising," he murmured. "Localized, not the broad pattern of strangulation, nor the bruising of a fall. It is consistent with pressure applied by fingers, briefly, firmly, while some agent was administered. Administered how? There was no syringe, no bottle." Holmes's gaze lifted. "Not all poisons require a needle, Inspector. Some enter by the simplest of doors, the mouth and the nose." He drew from his pocket a small cloth packet, unfolded it, and revealed a strip of white fabric, a handkerchief freshly washed. He held it beneath my nose. A faint, sweetish odor rose from it. Sharp, chemical, unmistakable. "Chloroform," I said at once. Holmes nodded. "You recognize it?" "As any medical man would. But, Holmes, chloroform would leave more obvious traces. Consider this chamber. Curtains drawn, windows sealed, fire extinguished. The air grows still. Heavy, introduce chloroform upon a cloth. Press it over the face, and the vapor saturates the space rapidly. The victim inhales, the nervous system collapses, and consciousness departs within moments." Inspector Gresham's eyes widened, but there was no struggle. "Precisely," said Holmes. "The victim was likely seated or reclining. The attack came from behind or from the side, swift and silent. Chloroform does not require violence to be effective. It requires only proximity and resolve." I looked again at Pembroke's face. The trace of terror now seemed to me more poignant, an expression of sudden recognition rather than prolonged agony, as if the last thing he saw was not death itself, but the hand that delivered it. Holmes's fingers moved again, this time to the wrists, the nails, the skin around the mouth. "No froth," he observed. "No signs of convulsion. The heart likely failed under anesthetic shock." Pembroke was thin, perhaps weakened by anxiety and solitude. In such a case, chloroform would be more than sufficient. He stood, turning slowly in the room. "And the roses," I said. "You believe they mask the smell?" Holmes lifted the vase and inhaled again briefly. "Roses have a powerful scent. They do not merely perfume a room. They dominate it. If one wished to conceal the faint chemical odor of chloroform, particularly from servants who might approach the door in the morning, one could do worse than place fresh roses at the bedside." Inspector Gresham muttered, "A neat touch." "A theatrical touch," Holmes corrected. "And therefore one characteristic of Caro." Gresham's eyes flashed. "Then you do think it was Caro?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he moved to the wainscot and pressed upon the concealed panel until it yielded. The cold breath of the passage flowed into the room. "Watson," he said, "come here." He pointed to a tiny notch along the inner frame of the panel. So small it might have been dismissed as a flaw in the wood. Around it the polish was worn, as if something had rubbed repeatedly. "A string has been drawn here," Holmes said quietly. "A string," I echoed. "Yes, observe the groove. It is not made by fingers or by a hinge. It is made by tension, by a cord pulled taut along this edge." He closed the panel partially, leaving only a narrow crack. Then he produced from his pocket a length of thin cord and looped it through the notch. With deft fingers he ran it along the edge of the panel and out into the passage. He turned to the door of the chamber, where the broken bolt had been temporarily replaced for examination. "The bolt," he said. "Old, stubborn, requiring lift and pressure. Mr. Hale described it. Now imagine a man inside the room who wishes to leave, but wishes the door to appear bolted from within after he is gone. Inspector Gresham stared. Impossible. Holmes's eyes glinted. Not if you know your mechanics. He opened the door slightly, revealing the bolt mechanism. Then, with the cord running through the notch behind us, he looped the cord around the bolt's sliding bar. Now, he said, if I pull the cord from the passage side. He stepped back through the panel into the narrow corridor, leaving me and Gresham in the room. The panel remained ajar by a finger's width. Holmes's voice came from within the wall. The bolt may be drawn into place. There was a soft scrape. The bolt slid. Gresham's eyes widened in disbelief. Holmes emerged again, closing the panel fully. The door was now bolted. He turned the handle. It would not open. A simple string mechanism, Holmes said calmly. Once the bolt is drawn, the cord may be withdrawn through the panel and the panel shut, leaving the room apparently secured from within. Inspector Gresham's face reddened. Then the murderer could leave and still produce the locked room illusion. Holmes finished. Exactly. A silence fell. The mechanism was so simple, so brutally practical, that it robbed the mystery of its supernatural glamour and replaced it with something more disturbing. The realization that careful human hands, not ghosts, had staged the sealed chamber. And the windows? Gresham asked hoarsely. Holmes shrugged. A sealed room need not be sealed in every direction. The windows were never required for ingress or escape. They were part of the illusion. He stepped to the bedside table and looked down at the roses. They served a double purpose, he said. Disguise and symbolism, an offering delivered by death's own hand. I could not help but think of Pembroke's lonely life, his walls and bolts and refusals. He had sought safety in separation, and yet that very separation had made him vulnerable. A man alone in a sealed room is a man with no witness. Holmes's eyes moved again to the corpse. The expression of terror, he murmured. Not the terror of pain, but of recognition. Pembroke knew his visitor. Caro, I said. Holmes's gaze did not confirm it, yet it did not deny it either. Whoever entered through that hidden artery came by appointment, he said. The impressed note proves it. Pembroke expected him. He was alone. He dismissed the servants. He bolted himself in, believing himself protected. Yet he had admitted his enemy through a door he did not know existed, or had chosen not to remember. Inspector Gresham took a step toward the door, as if eager to act. Then we must find Caro at once. Holmes's hand rose gently. We must find him, yes, but we must also find what he came for. The locked box, I said again. Holmes nodded. Pembroke's fear centered not on violence, but on leverage. Caro's betrayal in business was not merely theft. It was control, and control is always exercised through some object, some document, some proof, some secret. He turned to the desk and the blank sheet of paper where the impression had been found. 11:30, as agreed, alone. Holmes repeated. Such words are not written to a friend. They are written to a man whose demands you cannot refuse. Inspector Gresham's voice was grim. Then Caro blackmailed him. Perhaps, said Holmes. Or perhaps someone blackmailed both men. Gresham stared. What do you mean? Holmes's eyes drifted toward the hidden panel and beyond it, toward the passage leading to the shed and the street. A passage like that is not merely an exit, he said softly. It is an advantage. Whoever controls it controls secrecy itself, and secrecy is a currency in which many men trade. He moved to the roses one final time, lifting them slightly and examining the stems. Too deliberate, he murmured. Too neat. A murderer in haste might have left the cloth behind, or knocked the vase, or forgotten to remove a trace. Here everything is arranged, composed, almost ceremonial. He replaced the vase. That suggests either a man of cold calculation, he continued, or a man who wished to send a message. Inspector Gresham's jaw tightened. To whom? Holmes looked at him steadily. To anyone who might later look upon the body and think, Caro has returned. The inspector fell silent, and I felt the ground shift beneath my certainty. If the roses were meant to point to Caro, then they might be as much a false signpost as a confession. Holmes folded his arms and stood very still, listening to the quiet of the chamber, as if it might yet speak again. "The method of murder is clear," he said at last. "Chloroform, in a confined space, administered silently through the hidden passage, followed by the resecuring of the bolt by cord. The locked room mystery dissolves into mechanism." He turned toward me, and there was a rare gravity in his eyes. "But the method is the least interesting part, Watson. The method tells us how a man died. It does not yet tell us why he was made to die in this particular fashion, with roses at his side, and the world convinced that no one entered." He stepped toward the door, his mind already moving beyond the corpse. "Now," Holmes concluded, "we must follow the trail from the roses to the man with the scar, and from the scar to the secret that drove Alistair Pembroke into retreat." And as we left the chamber, the scent of crimson roses clung to my clothes like a lingering accusation, sweet and suffocating, as if the dead man's room itself had been taught to breathe poison. Chapter: Ife motive rooted in betrayal. It was late evening when Holmes gathered us in the somber study below stairs. The lamps were lit, their yellow glow pressing back the encroaching fog at the windows. Inspector Gresham stood near the hearth, arms folded. Edmund Pembroke occupied a rigid chair by the desk. Thomas Hale hovered near the door, pale and hollow-eyed. I took my accustomed place beside Holmes. Upon the desk lay several objects arranged with deliberate care. The scrap bearing the sand from Cartwheel Street, the thin length of cord, the handkerchief faintly redolent of chloroform, and one crimson rose removed from the vase upstairs. Holmes stood behind the desk, his long fingers resting lightly upon its polished surface. His face was composed almost austere. "We are now in possession," he began, "of the means by which Mr. Alistair Pembroke met his death. We have traced the hidden passage from his chamber to the rear shed. We have established that roses were purchased in person and conveyed through that very artery. We have determined that chloroform, administered in a confined space, would suffice to end a life swiftly and silently. And we have demonstrated how the chamber was resecured to create the illusion of solitude." Inspector Gresham inclined his head. "Then the rest is motive." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Just so, and motive, gentlemen, is rooted not in the mechanics of murder, but in history." He turned toward Edmund Pembroke. "Your brother's partnership with Edwin Caro ended in acrimony. Financial discrepancies were discovered. Funds had vanished, though no formal charge was brought. Suspicion settled, heavily and publicly, upon Caro." Deedman nodded stiffly. "Yes," Holmes continued, his tone measured and precise. "Caro was not prosecuted. Mr. Pembroke could not produce evidence sufficient for court, yet he withdrew from the partnership and severed all association. In doing so, he did not denounce Caro outright, but neither did he defend him. His silence, in effect, condemned his former partner socially." Inspector Gresham frowned. "You mean society assumed guilt?" "Precisely. In commercial circles, suspicion is often as lethal as proof. Caro's name became tainted. Credit dries up. Invitations cease. Associates retreat." Holmes lifted the rose from the desk and examined it thoughtfully. "A man like Caro, ambitious, proud, accustomed to charm and influence, would feel such ruin keenly. He might blame not merely the exposure of discrepancies, but the man whose vigilance revealed them." "Pembroke," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "From Caro's perspective, it was Pembroke who destroyed him. Whether Pembroke acted from honesty or self-preservation is immaterial to the resentment it engendered." Edmund's voice trembled, "But my brother never accused him publicly." Holmes's gaze was steady. "He did not need to. He withdrew. He dissolved the partnership in business. That is accusation enough." Inspector Gresham shifted impatiently. "Resentment is common. It does not always lead to murder." "No," Holmes agreed. "But resentment combined with knowledge of a secret passage, knowledge of a man's habits, knowledge of his fear, that is another matter." He moved to the wall and, with a swift gesture, sketched upon a sheet of paper a rough diagram of the house, chamber, passage, shed, alley. This concealed corridor, he said, tapping the line with his pencil, was not an accident of architecture. It was constructed deliberately. The timbers are reinforced, the hinges oiled. The passage is designed for discreet transport. He looked toward Edmund. Who would possess both the means and the motive to construct such a thing? Edmund hesitated. My brother imported valuable goods, rare dyes, chemical compounds. Some shipments required secrecy. Indeed, Holmes replied. And who was his partner in those enterprises? Caro. Holmes inclined his head. It is reasonable to conclude that the passage was known only to the two men who required it. A conduit for valuable imports, perhaps for items whose public arrival might invite scrutiny. Inspector Gresham's eyes narrowed. Smuggling. Holmes raised a hand. I accuse no one of illegality, Inspector, but discretion is often prized even in lawful trade. He set down the pencil. Thus we have two men bound by enterprise and by a shared secret. The partnership collapses. Caro departs in disgrace. Pembroke retreats into solitude, trusting no one beyond his servant. He bolts himself in nightly. He dismisses correspondence unopened. He fears exposure or return. Holmes's voice grew softer. Then, 2 days ago, Caro is seen on Cartwheel Street purchasing roses. He pays in exact coin. He carries them himself. He proceeds by means of the alley and shed, through the hidden artery known to him alone. Inspector Gresham's jaw tightened to confront Pembroke. Yes. Holmes resumed his place behind the desk. The impressed note upon the blotter reads, 11:30, as agreed, alone. Pembroke expected him. He dismissed the servants. He extinguished the fire. He sealed the windows. He believed, perhaps, that he controlled the conditions. And instead, I said, he created the perfect chamber for chloroform. Holmes inclined his head gravely. Caro required no blade, no pistol, only vapor. In the confined air, its effect would be magnified. A cloth pressed briefly over the mouth and nose, minute bruising at the throat consistent with restraint. Consciousness fades, the heart falters. Edmund covered his face with one hand. Holmes's voice did not waver. Once the deed was done, Caro arranged the roses upon the bedside table. Why? Inspector Gresham answered harshly, to mask the odor. Yes, said Holmes, the sweet scent of roses would dominate the chamber, disguising any lingering trace of chloroform. But there is more. He held up the bloom again. A gesture of irony. Roses are tokens of friendship, reconciliation, remembrance. What greater mockery than to deliver them as accompaniments to death? I felt a chill at the thought. Holmes continued. Caro departs by the hidden passage. From within the wall, he draws the bolt into place by cord. He withdraws the string and seals the panel. The chamber appears inviolate. The servants discover a locked room, a dead master, and roses as the sole intrusion. Inspector Gresham exhaled slowly, a vengeance both calculated and theatrical. Holmes's expression hardened slightly. Caro is not a man of impulsive violence. He is a man of presentation. He would wish the death to speak. Edmund looked up, his face stricken. Speak what? That betrayal begets betrayal, Holmes replied quietly. That silence can wound as deeply as accusation. The room fell silent. Thomas Hale shifted uneasily near the door. Then it was him, he whispered. The master's fear was justified. Holmes regarded the servant with a measured look. Fear, he said softly, is rarely unjustified. It is often misdirected. Inspector Gresham straightened. I shall issue a warrant for Caro's arrest. Holmes did not immediately object. He walked instead to the window and drew aside the curtain slightly, gazing into the fog-shrouded square. There is one matter, he said at last, which must not be overlooked. Gresham turned sharply. What matter? Holmes spoke without turning. If Caro's motive was vengeance, why wait 2 years? Why not strike earlier, when resentment was freshest? Gresham frowned. Perhaps he lacked opportunity. Perhaps, Holmes allowed. Or perhaps something altered recently, something which compelled his return. He turned back to us, his eyes intent. Consider this. The hidden passage was known to both partners. If Caro sought revenge alone, why purchase roses openly on Cartwheel Street, risking recognition? Why not approach unseen from the outset, to mask the smell? Gresham insisted. Yes, Holmes said calmly, but the roses also ensured that suspicion would fall upon the man known for theatricality and charm, a scarred gentleman purchasing flowers. Easy to remember, easy to recount. Inspector Gresham's brows knitted. You doubt your own conclusion? Holmes smiled faintly. I distrust conclusions which align too neatly with expectation. He moved again to the desk and tapped the locked wooden box. We have spoken of betrayal, but we have not yet examined the object which lay at the heart of that betrayal. Edmund looked uneasy. You believe my brother kept something here? I am certain of it, Holmes replied. A document, perhaps. Evidence of the financial discrepancies. Proof, which he never presented publicly, yet preserved privately. And Caro returned to reclaim it, I said, or to destroy it. Inspector Gresham looked impatient. If Caro killed him, that suffices. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Justice demands sufficiency, Inspector. Truth demands completeness. He paused, then spoke with quiet emphasis. Caro believed Pembroke responsible for his ruin. That resentment forms the root of motive. The concealed passage provided access. Chloroform provided method. The roses provided concealment and symbolism. All the elements align. He allowed the words to settle. Yet alignment is not identity. We must confirm that Caro gained what he sought, or that he failed. Edmund rose abruptly, then opened the box. Holmes's eyes rested upon it thoughtfully. Yes, he said. It is time. He took from the desk the small ring of keys recovered earlier, and began, one by one, to test them against the lock. As he did so, the fog outside pressed closer against the panes, and the lamplight cast long shadows across the study walls. Shadows that seemed, for an instant, to resemble two figures locked in silent dispute. Motive, Holmes had said, was rooted in betrayal. Whether that root belonged solely to Edwin Caro, or whether it fed upon deeper soil, remained even then to be revealed. Chapter X Fay, the arrest, and the lesson the apprehension of Edwin Caro occurred, not amid dramatic pursuit, but in that subdued and almost anticlimactic manner by which many carefully executed crimes conclude. Holmes, having satisfied himself as to the method and probable motive, lost no time in communicating his findings to Inspector Gresham. Telegraphs were dispatched discreetly to the principal railway termini, and within 24 hours a reply came from King's Cross. A tall gentleman answering Caro's description had purchased a northbound ticket under his own name, carrying little luggage and appearing, as the station master delicately phrased it, ill at ease. We arrived as the evening train stood hissing beneath the vaulted roof, steam curling upward like restless spirits. Caro had not yet boarded. He stood apart upon the platform, gloved hands clasped behind his back, his dark overcoat buttoned to the throat, his broad hat drawn low. Even before Holmes spoke his name, I recognized the faint white line along the left jaw, a thin scar catching the lamplight precisely as the florist had described. Mr. Edwin Caro, Holmes said evenly. The gentleman turned. His face bore the refinement of one accustomed to society, but fatigue had etched itself about his eyes. For a moment he attempted composure, and might even have achieved it had not his gaze flickered, involuntarily, toward the exit of the station. I do not believe I have the pleasure, he replied coolly. Holmes inclined his head slightly. You have the pleasure of being recognized. Inspector Gresham stepped forward, flanked by two constables. We have questions regarding the death of Mr. Alistair Pembroke. At that name, something altered in Caro's expression. Only a fraction, yet unmistakable. It was not surprise, but resignation. You mistake me, he said. though his voice had lost its earlier ease. Holmes's tone remained almost conversational. "You purchased roses on Cartwheel Street, 2 days prior to Mr. Pembroke's death. You carried them yourself. You traversed the alley behind Pembroke House and entered by means of a concealed passage known only to you and the deceased. Within his sealed chamber, you administered chloroform in sufficient quantity to cause cardiac arrest. You then arranged the roses at his bedside, masked the chemical odor, and secured the door from within by a simple cord mechanism before departing unseen." Caro's composure wavered. His gloved fingers tightened imperceptibly. "A charming fiction," he said. Though the effort of maintaining disdain was evident, Holmes continued as though uninterrupted. "The grit within the vase matches the sand of Cartwheel Street. The florist recalls your scar. The passage bears the marks of narrow wheels consistent with a crate, transported from shed to chamber. Minute bruising upon the throat confirms restraint during chloroform administration. And the bolt. Ah. The bolt operates most obligingly when persuaded by string." Inspector Gresham added curtly, "You were seen purchasing the roses paid in exact coin, no card." Caro's jaw tightened. Holmes's voice softened slightly, and in that softness there was a precision more cutting than accusation. "You believed the sealed chamber an unbreakable illusion. A man alone, a door bolted, windows fastened. The appearance of impossibility would deflect suspicion into confusion, and indeed, it might have, had not the roses traveled." Caro's eyes flicked, involuntarily, toward Holmes. "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "Travel implies passage. Passage implies opportunity, and opportunity leaves residue." For several seconds, there was only the hiss of steam and the distant clang of metal couplings. Then Caro exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders as though he had been holding himself upright by sheer force of denial. "It was he who ruined me," he said at last, not loudly, but with a bitterness that cut through the station's noise. "He found the discrepancies and whispered them in every corridor without ever speaking my name. I was judged without trial, shunned, reduced." Holmes's gaze remained steady. "Mr. Pembroke brought the discrepancies to light," he said. "Whether by whisper or withdrawal, society reached its own conclusion." Caro laughed softly, without mirth. "Society requires little encouragement." Inspector Gresham stepped closer. "You deny the act?" Caro's eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, the defiance had ebbed. "I deny nothing," he said. "I merely state that he forced my hand." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You returned not with pistol or blade, but with vapor. You arranged a meeting. You entered by the passage you both once used to move your precious imports. You pressed the cloth, briefly, efficiently. He looked at you. Did he not?" Caro's face tightened. "He understood," he muttered. "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "Recognition often precedes fear." Inspector Gresham signaled to the constables. "You will come with us." Caro did not resist. As they led him away, he glanced once more toward Holmes. "The roses," he said bitterly. "He once said they were vulgar, too obvious. I thought," Holmes finished the sentence for him, "that they would be an appropriate irony." Caro gave the faintest nod and was gone. Later that evening, as we returned to Baker Street, I found myself reflecting upon the curious simplicity with which the elaborate illusion had collapsed. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the lamps shone clearer against the dark. "It seems almost too precise," I said at last. "So careful a construction undone by a handful of sand." Holmes gave a faint smile. "There is no such thing as a perfect illusion, Watson, only an incomplete observer." He settled into his armchair, long limbs extended toward the fire. Caro believed that by sealing the obvious entrances he had sealed the truth. He relied upon astonishment. Men confronted with impossibility abandon analysis. They seek marvel rather than mechanism. And you sought mechanism. Always. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "Consider the roses were fresh. Therefore they traveled. The water contained street sand. Therefore it came from without. The room exhibited a draft where no draft should be. Therefore there was an aperture, From aperture to passage, from passage to shed, from shed to street, the chain was unbroken. And the bolt, a matter of physics and patience. Holmes replied lightly. No room is truly closed if human ingenuity once shaped its walls. I thought of Pembroke's retreat, the bolts, the drawn curtains, the extinguished fire. A man who had built his life into a fortress, undone by a door he himself had commissioned. He feared Caro, I said. Yes, and that fear drove him into isolation, which, Holmes observed, made him most vulnerable to the one man who understood the architecture of his solitude. He rose and moved to the mantel, where a single crimson rose, retrieved as evidence, now rested in a small glass. Symbols, he said softly, are dangerous things. Caro meant the roses as mockery. Friendship remembered in bloom, delivered in vengeance. Yet in choosing so vivid a token, he ensured that attention would fix upon them. And they betrayed him. Quite. Holmes turned toward me, and for a moment the detachment for which he is known gave way to something more reflective. Remember this, Watson. Deception thrives in complexity. But truth resides in detail. A sealed chamber, a bolted door, a vanished visitor. These are grand gestures, but a grain of sand in water, a tremor in a match flame, a faint bruise at the throat. Such small things cannot conspire. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels faint upon the damp street. Thus ended, Holmes continued, the mystery of the sealed room, not by force, nor by dramatic revelation, but by observation, patient and exact. The roses, so vivid in death, betrayed the very hand that placed them. He resumed his seat and reached for his violin, drawing the bow lightly across the strings in a contemplative phrase. And once more, he concluded quietly, truth entered, where deception believed no door existed. I watched him there in the firelight, the music rising and falling like measured thought, and I reflected that while men may construct walls, passages and illusions with cunning care, there will always remain for Sherlock Holmes some unnoticed aperture through which reality breathes.